Growing up in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was the town's pulse. Schools closed for the first day of rifle season, and the woods were usually a place of community and tradition. But in November 2021, during the late archery season, the silence of the North Pennsylvania wilderness turned predatory. I was 23 and comfortable hunting alone, or so I thought, until I stepped onto a 70-acre plot of private land owned by a family friend. The morning began with a light dusting of snow and a heavy feeling, the kind of instinctual prickle on the back of your neck that tells you that you aren't the only apex predator in the area. Once the sun rose, I noticed an anomaly. A cheap, weathered ladder stand about 60 yards away that hadn't been there the weekend before. More unsettling was the snow. There was only one set of tracks leading directly from the deep brush to the base of that stand. No exit wounds in the snow, just a path leading in. Around 8 a.m., he stood behind a tree, staring directly at me, and gave a slow, deliberate wave. It wasn't a greeting, it was a notification of presence. When he stepped behind the tree, he never came out the other side. Later, when I checked the spot, the snow was undisturbed. No tracks leaving the tree, no sound of footsteps. Just an empty ladder stand with a fresh layer of snow on the seat. The day devolved into a series of psychological markers. I found strips of orange hunting vests tied to branches at eye level, forming a trail that felt less like a path and more like a boundary. By the time I decided to leave at dusk, the woods had transformed. The orange strips were now tied to sticks driven into the earth, and from them hung the grisly remains of squirrels, crows, and a rabbit, strung up by wire through there. The true horror hit when I found my own backpack. I had left it 20 feet up in my tree stand, yet there it was, sitting on the forest floor 100 yards from my truck. It was zipped open. My knife, my extra arrows, and my flashlight were laid out in the snow in a neat, perfect line. Someone had climbed my stand while I was in it or near it, taken my belongings, and performed a taxonomical inventory of my gear. As I reached my truck, I found my door unlocked and my registration papers sitting on the seat. Looking into the tree line, I saw the man in the gray hoodie one last time. He didn't wave. He dragged a finger across his throat. Was the inventory of gear a warning of what he intended to do to the owner? Or was he simply showing how easily he could have ended the hunt before it even began? Crockett, Texas, is known for its thick woods and deep history. But for one grandson visiting his grandfather's lease, it became the site of a biological mystery. Unlike the Pennsylvania encounter, which felt like human malice, this trip felt like an encounter with something that didn't belong in a textbook. The property was a secluded getaway, centered around an old house built by the grandfather's father, deep enough into the woods that the outside world ceased to exist. The first sign of trouble was a scratching at the window screens on the first night. A sound too rhythmic for a branch and too heavy for a squirrel. The next morning, while sitting in a hunting blind, the grandson spotted a figure peeking around the trees nearly a mile away. It moved with a level of awareness that suggested it was tracking their movements. When the grandfather dismissed it as mere wildlife, the tension only simmered, until they returned from a supply run to find their harvested deer mutilated. The carcass, which had been hung up to be cleaned, was covered in deep claw marks and jagged bite wounds. This wasn't the work of a clean scavenger. It looked like a frantic, violent assault. Suspecting coyotes, they went out for a night scout armed with ARs. In the pitch black of the Texas brush, they caught a glimpse of something watching them again. When the grandfather went into the woods to flush it out, a single shot rang out. He had killed a coyote that seemed uncharacteristically aggressive, but the victory was short-lived. A sound erupted from the darkness that silenced the woods. A scream that wasn't human yet wasn't an animal. It was a high-pitched, metallic screech that vibrated in their chests. As they sprinted back to the house, the sound of heavy, bipedal footsteps thudded behind them, accompanied by the sound of labored, wet breathing. They barely made it inside before the entity began slamming against the heavy wooden door. The grandfather pushed past the point of fear, fired several rounds through the door. Another bone-chilling screech followed, and then the sound of something heavy retreating into the trees. When the deputy arrived, he found the marks on the door and the mutilated coyote, but no tracks that made sense. When an animal displays behavior that contradicts its nature, is it a sign of disease, or are we witnessing a predator that has learned to mimic the sounds of the woods to lure us out? The silence of the November wilderness was the first thing that betrayed us. We had hiked miles into the jagged mountain backcountry for a weekend of total isolation. Kyle, an expert woodsman who thrived on the rugged edge of the world, and Connor and I, two novices fueled by the warmth of a campfire and a few cans of beer. But as the sun dipped behind the frozen peaks, that isolation began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a predatory trap. The first night, an explosion of sound ripped through the canopy that froze the marrow in our bones. A long, harrowing shriek that mimicked a woman being murdered in a state of terminal agony. Kyle tried to pass it off as a vixen's scream from a fox, a notorious sound that can sound eerily human, but his white-knuckled grip on his rifle and the sweat beading on his forehead told a different story. The sound didn't stay put. It hunted. It started a mile away, echoing off the rock faces, and within minutes, it was hovering just 100 yards from our dying fire, circling us in the blackness. We spent that night in paralyzed silence, huddling in our sleeping bags and listening to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of a forest that suddenly felt far too small. Morning brought a chilling revelation that no fox could explain. Our campsite hadn't been raided by a hungry animal. It had been curated by something with a mind. Our folding chairs had been moved into a perfect, mocking circle around the dead embers, and the heavy coolers had been displaced 20 feet away, stacked neatly but left completely unopened. There was no chaotic mess, no torn plastic, just a deliberate, silent message that our privacy was an illusion. Despite the mounting dread, Kyle's stubbornness drove us deeper into the brush. By mid-afternoon, he had successfully harvested a buck, and as we dressed the animal, the metallic, cloying scent of fresh blood hung heavy in the damp air, acting as a catalyst for the horror to follow. As the second night fell, the atmosphere curdled. The scream returned, but it was no longer a distant threat. It was a vibrant, vibrating ultimatum. In a fit of mounting terror and drunk courage, Kyle stood up and fired warning shots to the void, screaming back to assert dominance over the dark. The response was a nightmare that still haunts my sleep. The entity screamed back immediately, now only yards away, standing right at the flickering edge of the firelight. We retreated into a single tent, huddling together with our rifles leveled at the thin nylon walls, which now felt as flimsy as paper. Then came the footsteps, not the lumbering gait of a bear or the light tread of a deer, but a frantic bipedal run circling our tent with impossible speed and weight. I felt the breath leave my lungs as something dragged a sharp object along the fabric, a slow rasping scratch that lasted for several feet, just inches from my head. Suddenly the world went dead for a full minute of suffocating, pressurized silence, only to be shattered by a scream so loud and so close it felt like it was originating from inside the tent with us. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, a vocalization of something that had forgotten how to be human. Kyle roared and emptied his magazine through the roof of the tent, and the sound of something heavy and powerful tearing through the brush followed. We fled at the first light of dawn, leaving our gear and our peace of mind behind. Years later, the narrator is still haunted by the logic of that night. If those were truly pleas for help, why did she only approach when the fire was out? And why did she never once use a human word? We didn't ignore a victim. We narrowly escaped the bait.